Hey everybody, Gary here, and as I mentioned in my previous video, I shot my first wedding, not this past weekend, but the weekend prior, and it was a really great experience. I was so happy, and as I said before, so honored to be part of Lindsay and Dan's big day, and the results were fantastic. I've never been more proud of something that I've shot in my life. There were just so many fantastic moments, fantastic images. I want to share some of those with you in this video and perhaps in others. But for now, I'd just like to, first of all, thank Dan and Lindsay for putting their faith in me to shoot such a special event. And this video is really going to be about the gear side of things, really, because I have to get a camera that I borrowed from my coworker back to them. So this is the A7 III, and this was actually the first time that I shot with one of the Sony 3rd generation full-frame mirrorless bodies. And of course, as you probably already know, if you've been following my channel, I shoot on the A7R Mark II, which is what I'm filming on right now. And it's a little bit of an older body, and there are definitely advantages when it comes to shooting with these 3rd generation, or in the case of the A7R4, 4th generation Sony mirrorless bodies. And I'm going to get into some of those key differences. But before I get into the differences, I just want to explain what my setup was for the wedding itself. So the reason I wanted to have 2 camera bodies was so that I could minimize the actual lens swapping that I had to do. And I was just working with the kit that I had and was very fortunate to pick up a Sony 85mm f1.8 just, I believe, a day prior, or maybe 2 days prior to the event itself. So that was a nice little pickup. The 85 is sort of a staple wedding lens if you look at any of the more reputable, wedding photographers on YouTube, I suppose. And I also use some relatively non-conventional wedding lenses. So I love my 55mm f1.8, which is what I'm filming on right now. It's a notoriously sharp lens. It's great when it's paired with a really high megapixel sensor. So that was nice to have. I usually had that on the A7 III, just on my hip, attached by a Peak Design capture clip. And the Sony A7R II was actually mounted with the 85mm f1.8. And that I just used the stock camera strap strapped around my chest. So I had easy access to, both. And it really made things much more seamless when I needed that slightly wider angle lens with the 55, where the 85 was just a little bit too tight. I know another really popular focal length for wedding photography seems to be the 24mm focal length, but because my other prime lens is just a little bit wider than that at 20mm, I felt that was just a little bit too wide, not quite as useful for most of the shots that I'd be taking. And another limitation, or another consequence of really the COVID-19 restrictions that were in place, is that we were this was a relatively intimate setting, let's say. I mean, there were only 15 people allowed at this gathering, at any wedding gathering with the current restrictions. And so because of that, if you shoot sort of a venue or an event where you only have 15 people and you have this very wide shot, all of a sudden things seem very, very empty, and nobody wants to have that feeling when you're looking at an event like this. So having, I think, those tighter focal lengths, the 85 I definitely used the most, but also the 55 as opposed to the 24 or even a 35, which I probably could have gotten away with. I think that the 55 was just tight enough for the most part that I could capture those slightly wider environmental shots to get a group of guests. And I think that those 2 lenses played really well off one another. The one other non-conventional wedding lens that I used, no one would consider this a wedding lens at all, I suppose, but again, using what you have on hand, I also shot with the 70-300 variable aperture zoom that was mounted on the Sony A7 III. And I used this during a portrait session with the soon-to-be married couple, Dan and Lindsay, in the park where they went on their first date. And I knew that with the 70-300 and with the environment that we were shooting in, I'd be able to get some shots with a lot of distance. So perhaps my favorite shot of the entire day, of the entire 8.5 hours of shooting, was actually a shot with the 70-300. And I was sort of on one side of a pond, and Dan and Lindsay were on the other side of a pond, walking through this wooded path and across this bridge. And there was just this wonderful composition that I was able to capture with the 70-300 and the A7 III. And, it had the look of almost a landscape photo. The foreground and background and subjects themselves were just sort of, compressed into this single plane. And, I thought it had this beautiful effect of the negative space. And then Dan and Lindsay positioned just off center. And I printed that off on a 13x19 print and framed it and gifted that to them as just a thanks for what is my first wedding shoot that I'll remember forever, and it was a fantastic experience. And but yeah, I'm just so very, very pleased with that photo, and there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, I mean, everyone loves their wedding photos, and they want to have them sort of distributed throughout their home, or perhaps at their office or something like that, in their cubicle or office. But what I really like about this particular photo is because it has more of a landscape feel. It's just nice that even as a very large print, you can sort of have it up on a wall displayed sort of prominently, and it never really overwhelms the feeling of other photos or other accents in the room. It's a predominantly green, lush, sort of relaxed photo, and then you have a couple that are clearly married, Lindsay and Dan, Lindsay in her wedding gown, Dan all suited up, but it doesn't scream wedding. It's just an inviting and soft and wonderful sort of landscape photo that they can look at and say, oh yes, this was our wedding day. I checked the forecast before the big day and saw that we were likely going to get rain, and so I picked up a couple of rain covers. Thank God that I did, because we had some really interesting shots in the park when the rain was really coming down. And I was able to protect my gear. The rain covers worked fantastically, and I think the rain added a really dramatic element to some of the shots. And having an umbrella, having the raindrops actually captured in frame, that it's something that you can't always get. And some people might look at it as like, oh darn, we've got rain. But when it comes to photography, you have the nice soft light because it's so overcast, and then you have those dramatic elements of the rain and the umbrellas that there's just no substitute. So I was really happy about that. As for the two camera bodies themselves, I would say that the A7 III is just a fantastic camera when it comes to battery life. I mean, I must have shot 700 shots or something on this thing and probably had 10% battery by the end of the day. I can't say the same for my Sony A7R II, which I had with a battery grip which holds 2 batteries, and I definitely swapped those out once and probably threw in a 5th battery by the time I was done shooting, and probably took in around 1,400 shots with the Sony A7R II. So the battery life on the 3rd generation bodies, absolutely fantastic. It's a real differentiator. When it comes to image quality, I wouldn't say that the two are in completely different leagues. I think that I prefer having the 42 megapixel sensor of the A7R II, just because it gives you a little more confidence that you can crop and recompose in post if you have to. Whereas with the 24 megapixel sensor in the A7 III, I found that when I was able to get things perfectly in frame, like that landscape shot in Shuby Park, there's just so much detail, and you can blow it up to a 13x19, or I'm sure even larger, and it's a perfectly detailed print that you're going to get out of that. And when it comes to the actual color science, I don't really like that term, the color science in the 3rd generation bodies. I would say that straight out of camera, when I load these photos into Capture One, I do somewhat prefer the look of the photos coming out of the A7 III, but as soon as you apply any kind of preset or do any kind of post-processing to give your photos that desired look, that consistent look and feel, you know, the built-in color science really, it doesn't matter at all. So, you know, it's a nice to have for, you know, quick, straight out of camera JPEGs. Not really essential if you do any level of photo editing. And honestly, if you're sinking, you know, $2 or $3 grand on a camera and a lens like you would with these, then I think you probably should be doing some degree of post-processing. The autofocus on the A7 III is absolutely fantastic. You know, the continuous eye autofocus is really nice. It shares that with the A7R II, but you can tell it's just snappier, it's stickier, it's faster, the tracking is better. The fact that it has animal eye autofocus also came in handy because Dan and Lindsay have 2 dogs and they're just so cute. And really having eye autofocus for animals just elevates pet portrait photography to, you know, completely unheard of levels. So I was really pleased to try that out with the 85 and the 55. And the other really big advantage of the A7 III over the A7R II and the second generation or first generation bodies is the buffer. And, you know, anyone that's shot with the A7R II will know that it's not the most nimble camera in the world. The autofocusing is, you know, it's good, maybe even great for relatively still subjects. But when you put that into continuous burst mode at, you know, a pretty modest 5 frames per second, it's not very long before that buffer starts to fill up and things start to slow down and then eventually stop. And you have to wait a while for things to read to the SD card. Whereas with the A7 III, you know, you can just shoot this thing at 10 frames per second, just bam, 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 with uncompressed RAW files. And it's like, it just never runs out of bandwidth. It just keeps on writing. And when you're trying to get moments like when the confetti is being thrown, or, you know, maybe even, you know, during a dance when there's a lot of movement going on and you're trying to get those moments in between moments. That high frame rate and that large buffer allows you to get photos that you just cannot with the A7R II. So again, big props to the 3rd generation bodies. And speaking of SD card slots, it is nice that the 3rd generation bodies have the dual card slots. It wasn't an issue this time around. I had only 1 card in each body, a 128 gig card in each body. I'd probably feel different if one of those cards had failed. So if you're regularly shooting events or weddings where you absolutely need an in-camera backup and you know, failure is not an option, I would say definitely the 3rd generation bodies are, you know, that's a necessary feature. I wouldn't feel comfortable doing this on a regular basis with just 1 card slot. And then finally, we've got the joystick and touchscreen, which I thought were nice added bonuses. I mean, you could do sort of a, you know, a flip out screen and just sort of do things very candidly. And of course, silent shooting enabled on both bodies the entire day, you know, particularly when you have, you know, a small gathering of about 15 people. That mechanical shutter is going to be distracting, and there are moments during the wedding itself where, you know, a mechanical shutter is going to be distracting. So having the silent shutter option at all is totally fantastic. It's especially great when you can shoot continuously on the A7 III. That's not what I was going to talk about, but it's a very important point, that continuous shooting, not present on the A7R II, but it is on the A7 III, and I found it to be quite useful. But as for the joystick and the touch screen, you know, if you're coming from smartphones and you're just accustomed to kind of tapping on your smartphone display and, you know, it's going to focus right there, then, you know, that's probably a really important selling feature. I mean, if that's your entry into, you know, interchangeable lens photography, then wow, you know, this is like a Mercedes, and really all you need is a Corolla to start off. But yeah, the you know, the touchscreen was nice, the joystick was nice, but if I had to be honest, I mostly used either flexible spot autofocus, where I didn't really move the focus spot around at all, or I was using a more automatic mode like eye tracking, like eye autofocus, and assigning that function to the focus hold button on the 85 or on the 70-300, or to the little center button by the ISO control. So yeah, they're nice to have. Wouldn't say they're essential, but there you have it. So there were a lot of lessons that I learned. Obviously, this being my first wedding, you're always going to learn something. There are some things that I probably would have done a little bit differently. A few things that I did accidentally that turned out, you know, totally fantastic, and I really want to share those experiences with you in another video. For now, I'm going to leave it here. Next time we'll be talking about the actual workflow and the editing, and I'll show you a few more of the totally fantastic shots that I got from this really special event. I've got to thank my buddy Jin Shan for lending me his A7 III. Couldn't have done this wedding without it, and of course, most importantly, thanks to Dan and Lindsay for letting me be, a part of their day, and and for capturing some, really important memories and moments. I'll never forget it. I don't think they will either. And yeah, it was great. So, until next time, all the usual stuff. Give the video a like if you liked it, subs if you loved it. Make sure you hit that bell notification so you get notified the next time I upload something else. And until next time, take more photos. Later.